This video is about Napoleon III and the Second French Empire. I hope you all have enjoyed your day, and I will apologize right now for any odd sounds that come through. My 11-year-old son is downstairs playing a very animated game of Fortnite, and my dog and my neighbor's dog are both outside, and neither of them seem too pleased about that at the moment. Napoleon III was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. We met him a bit ago, and I'll talk about his rise to power again in just a minute. But he, along with Camillo Cavour in Italy and Otto von Bismarck in Germany, are the standard bearers of a new kind of politics that came to dominate Europe in the mid to late 19th century. These guys were all very conservative in their own personal view in politics, but they practiced a kind of politics that came to be called realpolitik, and Bismarck is most associated with this. But we cannot overlook Napoleon III as a really successful practicer of realpolitik. Realpolitik is, of course, the practice of the politics of realism. It is not the ideologically pure politics of Metternich. And so Metternich would have disapproved of these guys in some ways, but these guys were able to use forces that were present in the society, like nationalism and even liberalism or socialism to a particular extent, to forward their objectives, to achieve their goals, and to maintain and bolster their own power. And so they are conservative leaders who use these forces effectively to protect and preserve their own power. And Napoleon III and Bismarck especially dominate European politics in the second half of the 19th century. Napoleon III, the emperor, was elected president of the Second Republic of France in 1848, following the successful revolution that deposed the King Louis Philippe. And he was really seen as the only person for the job. There were deep political divisions in France, and I showed y'all this cartoon before when we talked about that. And so he became the president in 1848. He was ambitious, and he was not interested in sharing power with an elected legislature or anything like that. And in 1851, he demanded from the French legislature that he be allowed to run again for president, to amend the Constitution to allow for that. And they said no. And he said fine. And he took over the government with the force of the military, and he went to the people and he held a vote. And he held what we called a plebiscite. His uncle, Napoleon I, did the same thing when he took control as emperor. He's like, hey, people, do you like me? Do you want me to be your leader? And Louis Napoleon said, president, how about for 10 more years? And he held a kind of vote called a plebiscite. And a plebiscite is simply a yes or no. And he got a resounding yes. The vote held with universal male suffrage. And so he thumbed his nose at the legislature, and he's like, I guess the people want me. And so he was back in. And just a couple of years later, he held another plebiscite asking if the people of France wanted the empire restored with himself as emperor. We have to remember nationalism. See, here he is. He's this autocratic, conservative ruler, and he's using the prevalent force of nationalism in France to advance his goals. Metternich thought nationalism was dangerous. Napoleon says, let's use nationalism to do the things that we want to do. And the First Empire, to many French people, you know, they're looking back on it and they're like, hey, it was the glory days. And quite frankly, they liked Louis Napoleon. They liked the job that he did. And so when he asked to restore the empire, the plebiscite, universal male suffrage, held with universal male suffrage, came back 97% affirmative. So there is going to be no arguing with that public opinion. The Second Empire was formed in 1852, and Louis Napoleon took the title of Napoleon III. The reason he took the title of the Third was because Napoleon I, the Napoleon, his young son, had been emperor for a very brief amount of time in 1814. So Napoleon takes on France, and the Second French Empire is formed. I like this drawing. I like this image. Here's Napoleon standing with his family. We see the flags and the drapery and all the finery. This is a great moment. Napoleon III, exploited the prevalence of nationalism very well. He also pursued a pretty successful set of domestic policies. So domestic policies, of course, policies that pertain to France. He maintained a legislature that was elected with universal male suffrage. However, they were a rubber stamp legislature. They could not initiate legislation. They couldn't do anything except agree with Napoleon and whatever he wanted to do. So that's what they did. And so he had absolute power in a lot of ways. He had a great deal of authority. But his domestic program was pretty successful, and so he was rather well liked. He benefited from a really good economy. This is never bad for a ruler, and France was prosperous during his reign. He was really supportive of industry. He built a ton of infrastructure, canals and railroads and all of that good stuff that helped to further bring more prosperity to France. He was friendly to the workers. He eased worker discontent in France with very generous policies to the poor and to the working class. He opened up hospitals to serve the poor and provide them with medical care for free. He abolished what were called the chapeau laws that prevented the French workers from forming unions and striking. So he abolished those so they could work to improve their situation that way. So he legalized trade unions, and he also went to some lengths to improve housing, etc. So he pursued this very successful domestic policy that was friendly to the industrial middle class, to the bourgeois. They liked his friendliness to industry, his support of industry and of infrastructure, etc. And he pursued policies that were favorable to the working class too. And so he eased the discontent of the people. It was very nice. Everybody liked him. Well, not everybody. There were liberals in France who he was not fooling. But for the most part, the people were pleased. On the domestic front, Napoleon III's most successful endeavor, and perhaps his greatest legacy, was the major redesign of the city of Paris that occurred in the 1850s. He started it in the 1850s. This was a major undertaking. It was very expensive, but it produced beautiful and good and lasting results. So this is probably one of his greatest legacies. The centerpiece of the redesign of the city of Paris was the lovely and beautiful Arc de Triomphe. If you've never been to Paris and seen the Arc de Triomphe, I hope you all have a chance to go one day. This is obviously a strongly nationalist monument. The Arc de Triomphe was actually commissioned by the Napoleon I in 1806 to celebrate French success and to honor fallen French soldiers. It was completed in 1836 by King Louis Philippe. And so it's this beautiful, romantic, strongly nationalistic monument to honor French valor in war and the French military. And Napoleon III made this monument, which is enormous. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, you can see the people there, and so you can see how little they are compared to this thing. He made this the center of the centerpiece of the redesign of the city of Paris. And so when you take a bird's eye view, this is what you see. Now, this is something, this major redesign of cities, it wasn't just Paris that did it. Napoleon III kind of gets the nod for this. He's the example how to do this and how to do it well. But this is something that happened all over Europe. All the major cities of Europe did this in the mid-19th century. They had to. There had been so much urbanization and growth because of industrialization, and we have studied that the cities were pretty gross. And the way that they were designed didn't make sense. The old cities of Europe were all medieval still. And so these redesigns not only took place in Paris, they took place in Vienna and in London and all over the place, even in places like New York, in Chicago in the United States. And so they all included some common things. For the old medieval cities in Europe, for Paris and for Vienna especially, they did this. One of the primary things that they did was to knock down the old medieval walls. The medieval cities had walls that were there as a mechanism for defense. We don't need those anymore, so they were knocked down to allow the city to grow. Lots of buildings were knocked down. Green spaces, parks, and squares were made. Wide avenues and boulevards replaced some of the old narrow medieval streets. And so I like this picture for showing you that. And so I think you can see the Arc de Triomphe as the centerpiece. And these wide boulevards go off like spokes kind of on a bicycle wheel off of this centerpiece, and they create the neighborhoods, etc., of France, and you can see the trees and all of that stuff. The Arc de Triomphe is at the head of the Champs-Élysées, which is the grandest boulevard in Paris, and includes the Palace of the President, not accidentally, etc. And so this beautification of the city, not just a modernization and a beautification, but the health and sanitation of the cities were also greatly improved in this. In Paris, for example, they laid new modern sewer lines. They created new and modern systems for the delivery of clean water. You can only imagine how much this helped. All 19th century cities had a huge problem with cholera, which is a gross and deadly disease that is waterborne. And it's bacterial, and the bacteria is carried in water. And so it's just nasty stuff, and there would be an outbreak of it, and a lot of people would die. I mean, thousands of people would die. It'd be terrible. So these new sewer systems, these new water systems really helped with the sanitation. The cities actually, as a result of this, had more sunlight. They were more pleasant. They had green spaces. Beautiful new buildings were built. Gas lights were put in on the city streets, so the streets could be illuminated at night, especially these big boulevards, these public places. So this is a major undertaking. Paris was redesigned by a German architect named the Baron von Haussmann, and so this is his great legacy too. Not only was the redesign of Paris beautiful, and not only did it improve sanitation, it was also a very practical endeavor. As we have learned in this class, the Parisians were prone to violence and to uprising and to revolt. And so these nice wide boulevards, you can't barricade those. Okay, they made it a lot harder to carry out open revolt and rebellion. People used to barricade the streets, and that would keep the army out. Well, this essentially negated the ability to barricade the street and keep the army out. The army could be, and other means of law enforcement could be quickly moved around, and it certainly did help to maintain the stability and safety of the city. So this is a beautiful and a practical new thing, and one of his very important legacies. But this kind of redesign of the city, I just want you to know, this happened all in a lot of old and important and big cities in Europe, most notably in Paris and in Vienna. This is a beautiful Impressionist drawing. We'll talk about the Impressionists next week on Art Day. Can't wait. But it demonstrates the beautiful buildings of the redesign, which had a very kind of Baroque look to them. French architecture, Second Empire, but the nice wide streets, which were heavily trafficked, of course. The nice wide boulevards. Here's a picture of beautiful boulevard in Paris and old buildings of the redesign of the Second Empire period. And I like the gas lights. You should hear these old gas lights. They were lit by gas and you could turn them on and off. They were a little bit dangerous because they were fueled by gas. You know, they could catch on fire and stuff, but they were they lit the streets. Can you imagine having the streets lit at night? It'd be pretty amazing in the 1850s, in the 1860s. This is the interior of a building, and I wish I knew for sure which one. And I wanted to show you guys this like the buildings of the redesigned Paris of the Second Empire. They were big and they were glorious and spacious, and they were really evocative in a lot of ways of Baroque architecture and everything, with all of the detail and kind of this fine richness and everything about them. In his foreign policy, Napoleon III generally was not as successful. So we're going to shift from his domestic policy to his foreign policy right now. And he generally wasn't as successful, even though we have already talked about the Crimean War, and so we're not going to spend a lot of time here. This was the feather in his cap. He did a good job in the Crimean War. France was successful there. In 1861, as Italy was going through the process of unification at the request of the Pope, Napoleon III sent French troops in to defend Rome. And as you will study in the unification of Italy, the question of what to do with Rome was something that was really kind of stressful to Count Cavour and to others, and certainly to the Pope. The Pope had always had not only spiritual authority in Rome, but temporal authority as well. You go all the way back to the Renaissance period in the Middle Ages and the great papal states and everything like that. They controlled all of that. So here they were literally talking just about the city and about the Vatican. But the French troops came in. Now, Napoleon III and Cavour, I think they got along okay. You know, they were good colleagues at least. And Napoleon III had actually negotiated a lot and was somewhat helpful to Cavour in the early unification process. But by sending his troops in and defending the Pope, this is sending a message to Cavour and to Garibaldi that Rome was off the table. And so Rome stayed off the table. Rome stayed independent under the authority of the Pope, guarded and protected by French troops. In 1861, Napoleon III also invaded Mexico. He joined the English and the Spanish in intervening in a civil war in Mexico. So these three European powers intervened to protect their commercial interests there, to protect their trade interests. Now, whoa, wait a second. What about the United States? Didn't they tell the European countries in 1823 to back off, that the Western Hemisphere was theirs? Y'all are so smart. Indeed, they did. But it was 1861. There was a civil war in France. And guess what? There was also a civil war in the United States. So USA was occupied. And so the European powers come in and they reestablished order in Mexico. Fun fact, on May 5th, 1861, I might have that year wrong, but on May 5th in the early 1860s, if it wasn't 1861, the French were defeated by Mexican forces in battle. And that is the root of the great celebration of Cinco de Mayo. The Mexicans lost this particular war, but they won that battle, which they celebrated. The French hung around. Napoleon didn't take his wins when they were there. He decided to push on. The United States, their war in 1864, 1865 was coming to an end, but the English had left Mexico thinking things were back under control. The Spanish had left Mexico as well, but Napoleon III made the decision to hang around and to press and advance his interests there. And he installed as the Emperor of Mexico a Habsburg Austrian Archduke named Maximilian, the Archduke Emperor Maximilian. And so this is kind of an imperialistic ploy. So here's Napoleon III. He has maintained military presence in Mexico all these years, and he has installed this Austrian Archduke as the emperor there. And so, of course, he's supposed to protect and advance Napoleon's interests. That's why he's there, right? And Napoleon was protecting him. The Mexicans were not excited about having this Austrian Archduke come to Mexico and be installed as their emperor. And Napoleon had to keep his army there to protect him. And so for 3 years, from 1864 until 1867, the only thing protecting this emperor was the French army. And in 1867, because things were heating up back in Europe, Napoleon had to withdraw his troops. But he left the emperor there. He thought he'll be fine, but he wasn't fine. Within just a few days, he was captured by Mexican rebels, and he was assassinated. This was a big failure for Napoleon III. This is a painting depicting the brutality of the assassination by the French painter Edouard Manet. And this was a big black eye. This was a big black eye for Napoleon. And it was the start of his troubles. Because as we shall see in a couple of days, he was about to have some big problems with Bismarck.